Imagine for a moment a city that is not just a city, but a gateway, a shimmering, neon-lit bridge between two worlds, between immense wealth and desperate poverty, between legal dreams and illicit fortunes. This is Tijuana, and for over a decade, the soul of this vibrant, chaotic border city was not held by its mayor or its police chief, but by a family so ruthless, so cunning, and so brutally efficient that they earned a name that would be whispered in fear from the slums of Mexico to the courtrooms of the United States. The Arellano Félix Brothers. They were the lords of the Tijuana Plaza, the masters of the most coveted drug trafficking route in the world. And their story is a Shakespearean tragedy written in blood, cocaine, and betrayal. But before we descend into their world, a crucial disclaimer. The narrative you are about to hear is a synthesis of historical accounts, declassified government documents, court testimonies, and investigative journalism. Our sole purpose is to present a comprehensive and accurate picture of these events, to ensure that the complex truth of this dark chapter reaches you, not as myth, but as documented history. So, if you are ready to understand the real story behind the headlines, to journey into the heart of a criminal empire that defined an era of violence, then listen closely. This is not just a story about drugs, it is a story about power, family, and the devastating cost of absolute ambition. The roots of this empire did not begin in the gritty backstreets of Tijuana, but in the verdant, mountainous state of Sinaloa, the cradle of Mexican drug trafficking. The Arellano Félix children, Benjamín, Ramón, Francisco, Carlos, Eduardo, and their sister Enedina were born into a respectable, middle-class family. Their father was a school teacher and their mother a devout woman, a background that starkly contrasts the legend they would become. The eldest brother, Benjamín, was the first to dip his toes into the criminal underworld, not as a kingpin, but as a municipal police officer in Culiacan. This position was less about upholding the law and more about understanding its mechanics, its vulnerabilities, and the intricate web of corruption that made the drug trade possible. It was during this time that the siblings came under the influential wing of their uncle, Miguel Ingel Félix Gallardo, the original godfather of the Mexican drug trade, who had unified the various trafficking factions under his banner, a consortium known as the Guadalajara Cartel. Félix Gallardo recognized the ambition and sharp intellect of his nephews, particularly Benjamín, and he entrusted them with greater responsibilities. They were not mere foot soldiers, they were being groomed for leadership. Benjamín, with his calm, strategic mind, became the organizer, the businessman. Ramón, even in his youth, displayed a terrifying, unpredictable ferocity that marked him as the family's enforcer, a role he would embrace and expand with chilling enthusiasm. The others found their niches. Francisco, known as El Tigrillo, was the savvy financial brain. Carlos was the quiet, logistical expert, and Eduardo, the youngest brother, was brought into the fold. Enedina, the sister, though often in the background initially, possessed a shrewd intelligence and a steely resolve that would later prove critical. Their apprenticeship under Félix Gallardo was their university of crime, and they were star students, learning the intricacies of smuggling, bribery, and violence. However, this golden age of centralized control was not destined to last. In 1989, the Mexican government, under increasing pressure from the United States, finally moved against Félix Gallardo, arresting him for his role in the murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena. His arrest created a massive power vacuum, a seismic shift in the criminal landscape of Mexico. The old federation shattered. It was at this moment of chaos and opportunity that the Arellano Félix Brothers made their move. They did not seek to rebuild the consortium. They sought to carve out their own kingdom. With a calculated boldness, they seized control of the Tijuana corridor, the crown jewel of trafficking routes, a direct pipeline into the insatiable drug market of California and the entire western United States. This was not a passive inheritance. It was a violent, audacious takeover. They understood that to control Tijuana was to control a river of gold, and they were prepared to drown anyone who stood in their way. They established their new base of operations, and the Tijuana Cartel, also known as the Arellano Félix organization, was born. Their reign had begun, and it would be forged in a fire of unprecedented brutality that would soon earn them a new, fearsome moniker, the Brothers of Death. With the Tijuana corridor firmly in their grasp, the Arellano Félix Brothers began the meticulous work of building not just a criminal enterprise, but an empire with the ruthless efficiency of a multinational corporation and the savage enforcement of a medieval fiefdom. Benjamín, the undisputed CEO of this dark enterprise, sat at the apex, a master strategist who preferred the shadows, orchestrating the flow of drugs and money with a cool, calculating intellect. He understood that corruption was not a side effect of their business. It was the very bedrock upon which it was built. Under his direction, the cartel embarked on an ambitious and systematic campaign to corrupt every single layer of law enforcement and government that could possibly pose a threat to their operations. This was not merely about bribing a few police officers to look the other way. This was about wholesale ownership. Senior commanders of the federal police, agents of the Mexican Federal Judicial Police, high-ranking army officials, and even politicians at the state and federal levels were all placed on the cartel's payroll. The price for cooperation was generous, often life-changing sums of money. The price for refusal, however, was unthinkable. This created a dual reality in Tijuana, a public face of a city struggling with crime, and a private truth where the real authority was the Arellano Félix organization. Their influence extended across the border, where they corrupted American customs officials, border patrol agents, and law enforcement officers, creating a seamless web of complicity that allowed their product to flow north and their cash and weapons to flow south with terrifying ease. While Benjamín managed the macro-level corruption and business strategy, Ramón evolved into the cartel's iconic and most feared element, the embodiment of its violent soul. He was not just an enforcer, he was an innovator of terror. He assembled and personally led a dedicated group of hitmen known as the Narco. juniors. These were not impoverished recruits from the slums. They were often university-educated, middle-class young men drawn from wealthy families who were seduced by the power, money, and adrenaline-fueled lifestyle that Ramón offered. They were charismatic, bilingual, and could blend seamlessly into the upscale nightclubs and resorts of Tijuana and San Diego, making them perfect for covert surveillance and sophisticated assassinations. Ramón armed them with the best weaponry money could buy, from AK-47s to grenade launchers, and instilled in them a culture of absolute loyalty and extreme violence. He was a showman of cruelty, often personally participating in kidnappings, interrogations, and executions, earning a reputation for psychotic brutality that even shocked other cartels. Under his command, the cartel's violence became more public and more theatrical. Bodies were not just disposed of. They were displayed, often bearing signs of extreme torture, with messages attached, a practice known as narcomensajes, or narco messages. These gruesome displays were not acts of random savagery. They were calculated instruments of psychological warfare, designed to send a crystal, clear message to rivals. Traders and authorities alike cross the Tijuana Cartel, and your death will be slow, public, and a lesson to all who witness it. This systematic corruption and institutionalized violence allowed the brothers to perfect their logistics. They moved tons of cocaine, sourced from the powerful Cali cartel in Colombia, across the border using every method imaginable, in secret compartments of commercial trucks, through sophisticated tunnels dug deep beneath the border, via speedboats along the Pacific coast, and even using light aircraft. They also maintained a massive marijuana and methamphetamine operation, establishing clandestine laboratories in the remote mountains of Baja California. By the early 1990s, the Arellano Félix organization was at the zenith of its power, a well-oiled machine generating billions of dollars, its influence permeating every facet of life in northwestern Mexico. They lived like kings, throwing extravagant parties, owning fleets of luxury cars, and building fortified mansions. But such absolute power inevitably breeds paranoia and attracts powerful enemies. The very audacity that built their empire was about to trigger a war that would turn the streets of Tijuana into a battlefield and set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately lead to their downfall. The first and most for their dominion emerged from within, and then emerged from within their own house with a warm, own ancestral home. Sinaloa, in the form of an ambitious and cunning former ally, Chapo Guzmán. Guzmán, along with his partner Hector Palma, had been key traffickers within the old Félix Gallardo Federation. But with the Godfather's fall, they harbored their own ambitions. The core of the conflict was a simple, yet explosive, issue of logistics and power. Guzmán and Palma believed they had the right to use the prized Tijuana route, the Arellano Félix Brothers' lifeblood, to move their own vast shipments of cocaine. For Benjamín and Ramón, this was not a negotiable business proposal. It was a direct assault on their sovereignty, a challenge that could not be tolerated. The refusal was absolute, and the response was immediate and brutal. The Sinaloa group, unwilling to be denied, began to make moves to infiltrate and wrest control of the plaza, attempting to corrupt the Arellano Félix's own contacts and law enforcement assets. This was the spark that ignited the war, a conflict that would become one of the most violent and defining in the history of Mexican drug trafficking. The opening salvo was a declaration of total war, orchestrated by Ramón Arellano Félix with his characteristic audacity and disregard for consequence. On May 24, 1993, he masterminded an assassination attempt that was unprecedented in its brazenness. The target was Joaquin El Chapo Guzmán, and the location was not a dark alley in Tijuana, but the bustling Guadalajara International Airport. Ramón dispatched a team of over a dozen hitmen, some dressed as federal police officers, armed with assault rifles and grenades. Their orders were clear: eliminate Guzmán at any cost. The hit squad located Guzmán's vehicle, a white Grand Marquis, and opened fire in the middle of the airport parking lot, unleashing a hailstorm of bullets. However, in a twist of fate that would alter the course of Mexican criminal history, their intelligence was flawed. Guzmán was not in the car. Instead, the vehicle carried a man who was the absolute opposite of a cartel kingpin: Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, the Archbishop of Guadalajara. The cardinal, dressed in his clerical attire, was caught in the crossfire and brutally murdered along with his chauffeur and 5 others. The assassination of a prince of the Catholic Church sent shockwaves through Mexico and the world, creating a political firestorm of unimaginable proportions. The Mexican government was forced into a furious and very public response. The official narrative, heavily disputed by many, was that it was a case of mistaken identity, that the hitman had confused the cardinal's luxury car with Guzmán's. Others speculated, more darkly, that it was a deliberate act meant to send a message of such terrifying power that it would crush all opposition. Regardless of the intent, the result was a catastrophe for the Arellano Félix Brothers. They were no longer just powerful criminals. They were international pariahs, the men who had killed a cardinal. The full, unrelenting force of the Mexican state, under intense domestic and international pressure, was now focused on their capture. The incident exposed the deep rot of corruption they relied on and forced many of their protectors in government and law enforcement to temporarily withdraw, lest they be caught in the ensuing maelstrom. The hunt for Ramón and Arellano Félix, now the most wanted man in Mexico, intensified dramatically. The Guadalajara airport attack was a strategic miscalculation of historic proportions. It failed to kill their primary rival, El Chapo Guzmán, who now had a personal blood-fueled vendetta against them. It turned the government from a sometimes complicit entity into an implacable enemy, and it painted a target on their backs that was visible to the entire world. The brothers, who had operated with such impunity, were now forced deeper into the shadows, their empire under siege from both a vengeful rival and a humiliated state. The golden age of their rule was over. The age of consequences had begun. The fallout from the cardinal's murder forced the Arellano Félix brothers into a new, more perilous existence, one defined by constant movement heightened paranoia, and an escalation of violence that plunged Tijuana into an era of bloodshed from which it would not soon recover. The public and political outrage was so immense that the Mexican government had no choice but to launch massive military and police operations in Tijuana, conducting raids on cartel safe houses and businesses, while their core corruption network remained largely intact. It was severely strained, forcing the brothers to rely even more heavily on their localized enforcement arm, the Narco Juniors, and a growing number of hired mercenaries. This period saw the cartel's violence become more decentralized and, consequently, even more chaotic and public. The war with the Sinaloa cartel was no longer a covert struggle for trafficking routes. It was a street-level battle for the very soul of the city, fought in its nightclubs, restaurants, and public avenues. The Arellano Félix Brothers, particularly Ramón, understood that their power was now predicated on a simple, brutal equation. They had to be more feared than the government or their rivals. This led to a campaign of terror aimed at anyone perceived as disloyal or affiliated with El Chapo Guzmán. Dozens, then hundreds of bodies began to appear across Tijuana. Victims were often tortured, their bodies bearing the cartel's signature markings: cigarette burns, drill wounds, and signs of prolonged, agonizing interrogation. Many were dumped in public places, often with narco messages explicitly threatening El Chapo or his lieutenants. One of the most significant casualties in this bloody feud was H. Hector, El Guerrero, Palma's wife, who was killed in a shootout, an event that further deepened the personal hatred between the two organizations. The violence was not confined to rival gunmen. It ensnared innocent bystanders, journalists who reported too closely on the carnage, and police officers who refused to be corrupted. The city lived in a state of siege, with frequent gun battles erupting in broad daylight, turning bustling commercial zones into war zones. The sound of sirens became the city's constant soundtrack. During this time, the brothers themselves became phantoms, rarely staying in one place for more than a night. Their communication conducted through a complex web of encrypted phones and trusted couriers. Benjamín, the strategist, worked feverishly to rebuild their political shields and diversify their operations, funneling billions of dollars into legitimate businesses in Mexico and the United States, from real estate and construction to restaurants and nightclubs, creating a labyrinthine financial structure to launder their profits and gain veneer of respectability. Meanwhile, Ramón, now a nationally recognized fugitive with a multi-million-dollar price on his head, became almost mythical in his elusiveness. He was known to travel with a large security detail, often using armored vehicles, and was reputed to have undergone plastic surgery to alter his appearance. He moved between luxurious, heavily fortified ranches in the Baja California countryside and safe houses in Tijuana's affluent neighborhoods, always one step ahead of the law. His notoriety only seemed to fuel his recklessness. He was frequently spotted at exclusive nightclubs, throwing lavish, drug-fueled parties, a bizarre juxtaposition of a man living in the crosshairs, yet indulging in a very public, decadent lifestyle. This period also saw the rising influence of the other brothers, Francisco Rafael, El Tigrillo, took on a greater role in the financial management and the intricate logistics of moving drugs across the border, proving to be as sharp and ruthless as his older brothers. Eduardo, El Doctor, though less involved in the day-to-day violence, managed legal affairs and further political connections. And quietly, in the background, their sister Inadina began to assume a more pivotal role. Dignified, intelligent, and fiercely loyal to her family, she started managing key aspects of the business. Her calm demeanor and organizational skills providing a stabilizing counterbalance to Ramon's volcanic temperament. The Tijuana Cartel, under immense pressure, was morphing. It was no longer just a family business. It was a hydra-headed monster adapting, becoming more resilient and more deeply embedded in the social and economic fabric of the region. They were bleeding, but they were far from defeated, and their capacity for retaliation against their Sinaloa rivals and the authorities remained immense, setting the stage for a series of events that would see the war spill catastrophically across the border into the United States. The war's dangerous spillover into the United States was not a gradual seepage, but a sudden, explosive eruption that demonstrated the Arellano Félix Brothers' global reach and their terrifying disregard for international borders. This new phase was triggered by a critical defection, a common but perilous event in the world of organized crime. A man named Jesus Blancornelis, along with several other high-level operatives, decided to break away from the Tijuana Cartel. More alarmingly for the brothers, Blancornelis began collaborating closely with the Sinaloa Cartel, providing them with invaluable intelligence about the Arellano Félix operations, routes, and security protocols. This was not just a loss of manpower, it was a direct threat to their operational security, a leak that had to be plugged with extreme prejudice. Ramón Arellano Félix personally greenlit a mission of such audacity that it would send a chilling message to any potential traitors on either side of the border. The formation of a dedicated assassination squad to hunt down and eliminate the turncoats within the United States itself. The man chosen to lead this border hit squad was a charismatic and cold-blooded individual named David Baron Corona. Baron was a perfect representation of the new generation of cartel operative bilingual, familiar with American culture and utterly ruthless. He recruited a team of about a dozen hitmen, a mix of seasoned Mexican assassins and American-born recruits, and established a base of operations in the bustling metropolitan area of San Diego, California. Their primary target was Jesus Blancornelis, who was now living in the San Diego area, believing himself to be beyond the long arm of the Tijuana Cartel. However, the hit squad's activities were not confined to a single target. They operated with shocking impunity on American soil, conducting surveillance, purchasing weapons, and planning multiple killings in a campaign of terror that stretched throughout the spring and summer of 1992. The American authorities, particularly the Drug Enforcement Administration, were aware of the rising tension but were struggling to grasp the full scope of the operation unfolding in their own backyard. The situation reached its terrifying climax on September 17, 1992, in the city of San Diego. David Barron and his team located a man named Jose Luis Alipez, known as Joe the Crow, a close associate of Blancornelis, who was suspected of aiding the Sinaloa faction. They abducted him from a car wash, and after a brutal interrogation, they murdered him, dismembering his body and disposing of it in a remote canyon. This gruesome act was a warm-up, a test of their procedures and their nerve. The main event was still to come. The hit squad's relentless pursuit of their targets showcased the Tijuana Cartel's sophisticated intelligence, gathering capabilities, and their ability to project power. They were not just Mexican criminals. They were a transnational criminal insurgency, capable of waging their bloody war in the quiet suburbs of American cities. The presence of this dedicated kill team on U.S. soil represented a fundamental escalation, a blatant challenge to American law enforcement sovereignty. It proved that the Arellano Félix Brothers considered the border to be nothing more than a line on a map, an imaginary barrier that could not contain their vengeance or their ambition. The American law enforcement apparatus, from local police to federal agencies, was now forced to confront the reality that the drug war was no longer a foreign conflict. It was a domestic threat of the highest order. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only expose the inner workings of the cartel, but also mark the beginning of a coordinated, binational effort to dismantle the Arellano Félix empire piece by piece. The brothers, in their quest to annihilate their rivals, had made a strategic error. They had brought the war to a nation with virtually limitless resources and a judicial system that, while slower, was far less corruptible than their own. The very act of crossing the border to kill would eventually provide the legal leverage needed to indict them in U.S. courts, creating a legal net from which they could not easily escape. The cross-border hunt reached its dramatic and violent crescendo, an event that would sear the name Arellano Félix into the American public's consciousness and become a landmark case in the annals of U.S. law enforcement. The hit squad, led by David Barron, had been meticulously tracking their primary target, Jesus Blancornelis, for weeks. Their intelligence finally pinpointed his location on a seemingly ordinary day, May 9, 1993, at a shopping center in the San Diego suburb of National City. Blancornelis was meeting with another individual connected to the Sinaloa faction. As Blancornelis sat in his car, a van pulled up alongside him. The side door slid open to reveal a team of hitmen, armed with AK-47 assault rifles. They opened fire in a deafening, sustained barrage, unleashing over 100 rounds into Blancornelis' vehicle, shattering glass and tearing through metal in a storm of violence that turned a peaceful parking lot into a war zone. Blancornelis, despite being hit multiple times, miraculously survived the assault. Shielded in part by a door panel and a briefcase that happened to deflect a critical bullet, his companion was not so fortunate and was killed instantly in the hail of gunfire. The assailants, their primary mission only partially accomplished, fled the scene, leaving behind a scene of carnage and a witness who would prove crucial, a security guard who managed to note the van's license plate number. This single piece of evidence became the thread that would begin to unravel the entire operation. The brazen, military-style attack in broad daylight in the heart of an American city sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies. It was no longer a hidden war, it was a public emergency. The investigation was immediately elevated to the highest priority, becoming a joint task force operation involving the FBI, DEA, ATF, and local police. The traced license plate led them to a safe house used by the hit squad, and from there, the net began to close rapidly. Through wiretaps, informants, and relentless detective work, the identities of the team members were uncovered. David Barron and several of his accomplices were tracked down and arrested in the following months. The subsequent trial in a San Diego federal court was a media sensation, providing the world with an unprecedented, detailed look into the inner workings and brutal methods of the Tijuana Cartel. Prosecutors laid out a chilling narrative of a sophisticated criminal enterprise operating with impunity on both sides of the border. The key witness, Jesus Blancornelas, now living under heavy guard, testified against his would-be assassins, detailing the bloody feud between the cartels. David Barron was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The successful prosecution of the hit squad was a monumental victory for U.S. authorities, but it was also a stark warning. It proved that the Arellano Félix Brothers were willing to export their trademark violence directly onto American streets, a line that few cartels had crossed with such flagrant disregard. This event fundamentally changed the nature of the U.S. government's involvement. It was no longer just about interdicting drugs at the border. It was about dismantling the command and control structure of the Mexican cartels themselves. The legal foundation was now laid for a comprehensive strategy of targeting the Arellano Félix leadership with the full force of American law. The brothers were indicted in absentia in multiple U.S. federal districts on a sweeping range of charges, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and racketeering. The pressure was now bifold, from a vengeful Sinaloa cartel waging a relentless war for the plaza on one side, and from the immensely powerful and resource-rich United States government on the other. The walls, both literal and metaphorical, were closing in on the brothers of death, and their once impenetrable fortress in Tijuana was beginning to show critical cracks under the strain of a two-front war they could not possibly win indefinitely. As the relentless pressure from the United States intensified, manifesting in frozen assets, sweeping indictments, and an ever-tightening noose of international surveillance, the internal dynamics of the Tijuana Cartel began to shift in a subtle but profound way. The constant state of war and the fugitive lifestyle started to take a heavy psychological toll on the brothers, particularly on Ramón, whose already volatile temperament became increasingly unpredictable and paranoid. His legendary parties grew more excessive, his drug use more rampant, and his commands more erratic. It was during this period that a new, equally ruthless figure began to ascend within the cartel's hierarchy, not a brother by blood, but a man who would become their most feared enforcer and a symbol of the organization's evolving brutality. Jesus Labra Valise, known by his alias El Chuy. Labra was a veteran narco-trafficker from Sinaloa with deep connections and a reputation for cold efficiency. He was brought into the organization to bolster their operations, but his ambition soon outstripped his role as a mere lieutenant. He formed a powerful alliance with Ramón, becoming his right-hand man and the operational commander of the cartel's day-to-day violent activities. Under Labra's direct supervision, the cartel's enforcement arm became even more structured and ruthless. He organized cells of hitmen, established safe houses, and streamlined the process of identifying and eliminating rivals, informants, and uncooperative officials. His influence grew so vast that he was often considered the de facto fifth brother, wielding power that sometimes even eclipsed that of Francisco and Eduardo. This rise of a non-family member to such a position of authority, while strengthening the cartel's military capabilities in the short term, also sowed seeds of internal tension and jealousy. The traditional, family-centric model was being challenged from within by a hired gun whose loyalty was ultimately to power and money, not to the Arellano Félix bloodline. Meanwhile, the war with the Sinaloa cartel entered a new, even more vicious phase. The conflict was no longer just about control of the plaza. It was a deeply personal vendetta. The Arellano Félix Brothers, in a move to cripple their rival, targeted El Chapo Guzmán's family, a common tactic in the brutal logic of narco warfare. In 1994, they orchestrated the kidnapping and murder of El Chapo's former wife, Maria de Los, in Angela's Gavilia Molinar. Her body was found discarded, bearing signs of torture. This act was not just a strategic strike. It was a message of absolute contempt and a declaration that no one connected to Guzmán was safe. The response from the Sinaloa cartel was predictably ferocious, leading to a series of retaliatory kidnappings and murders of Arellano Félix associates and their family members. The violence became a self-perpetuating cycle of atrocity and counter-atrocity, each act more heinous than the last, further dragging the civilian population of Tijuana into the crossfire. The city's murder rate skyrocketed, earning it the grim international reputation as one of the most dangerous cities in the world. During this time, the cartel also faced challenges from within its own ranks. The immense rewards offered by the U.S. and Mexican governments for information leading to the capture of the brothers began to tempt those within their organization. The culture of absolute loyalty began to fray at the edges as the risks started to outweigh the rewards for some lower and mid-level operatives. This internal paranoia led to purges within the cartel, with Ramón and Labra ordering the executions of members suspected of disloyalty or of being potential informants. This climate of fear, while effective in maintaining discipline in the short term, also made the organization more brittle, more isolated, and ultimately more vulnerable. The empire was still immensely powerful, its revenue streams vast, and its control over the plaza largely intact. But the foundations were cracking under the combined weight of external enemies and internal decay. The brothers, who had once operated with the confidence of untouchable kings, were now rulers of a kingdom under perpetual siege. Their every move scrutinized, their every ally a potential traitor, and their every day lived with the knowledge that it could be their last. The turning point. The beginning of the irreversible end for the Arellano Félix Brothers' reign arrived not with a dramatic siege or a massive police operation, but through a combination of relentless investigative pressure, a critical mistake, and a dose of fate. For years, the Mexican and American authorities had been building their cases piece by painstaking piece, collecting evidence, turning low-level operatives, and mapping the cartel's vast financial and operational networks. The first major crack in the dynasty's armor appeared on the morning of February 10, 2002, in the Pacific Coast resort city of Mazatlan, Sinaloa. Ramón Arellano Félix, the cartel's iconic and most feared enforcer, the man who had embodied its violent soul for over a decade, was dead. The circumstances surrounding his death remain shrouded in a degree of mystery and controversy. But the official account states that he and a companion were driving through Mazatlan when they were pulled over at a military checkpoint. Ramón, perpetually paranoid and always armed, allegedly opened fire on the soldiers. In the ensuing shootout, he was killed, his body left lying on the pavement. The news sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld and law enforcement agencies alike. The Mexican government heralded it as a major victory, the elimination of one of the country's most wanted men. However, many questions lingered. What was Ramón, the king of Tijuana, doing deep in the heart of Sinaloa, the territory of his mortal enemies? Some speculated he was there for a secret meeting, perhaps to broker a fragile truce or to target a high-value enemy. Others believed he was lured into a trap. Conspiracy theories swirled that he was executed by his own bodyguards or by rival gunmen, with the checkpoint story serving as a cover. Regardless of the exact truth, the impact was undeniable and catastrophic for the Tijuana Cartel. Ramón was more than just a chief of security. He was a legend, a symbol of invincibility whose brutal reputation alone had kept countless rivals and potential informants in check. His death created a power vacuum and a profound crisis of morale within the organization. The psychological blow was immense. The brother of death was dead, and the end was not finished with them yet. Just a month later, on March 9, 2002, the other pillar of the organization, the strategic mastermind Benjamín, Arellano Félix, was captured by the Mexican army in the state of Puebla. The operation was the result of months of meticulous intelligence work, tracking his communications and movements. He was arrested without a single shot being fired, found in a modest safe house, a far cry from the opulent lifestyle he had once commanded. His capture was an even more significant blow than Ramon's death. Benjamín was the architect, the CEO, the man who held the entire complex enterprise together. He knew every corrupt official, every financial route, every logistics chain. With him in custody, the cartel's brain was severed from its body. The Mexican government swiftly extradited him to the United States, where he would eventually face a federal court. The 1-2 punch of Ramon's death and Benjamin's capture within a single month marked the definitive end of the classic Arellano Félix era. The organization was decapitated, its leadership either dead or in prison. The myth of their invulnerability was shattered forever. The streets of Tijuana, for so long a battlefield under their dominion, experienced a palpable, if tentative, shift. The constant, overt displays of cartel power diminished, though the violence, now more fragmented, would continue. The fall was as swift as their rise had been meteoric. In the span of a few weeks, the brothers who had terrorized a nation and challenged a superpower were gone from the board. Their empire, suddenly leaderless and adrift, vulnerable to the vultures that had been circling for years, waiting for just such a moment of weakness to pick their carcass clean. The sudden and near simultaneous removal of both Ramón and Benjamin from the chessboard of power created a vacuum of such magnitude. It threatened to tear the Tijuana Cartel apart from the inside out. In the immediate aftermath, a fierce and bloody struggle for succession erupted. A civil war within the organization that pitted remaining family members against powerful lieutenants who saw an opportunity to seize control for themselves. The most prominent internal challenger was Jesus Labra Vaz, El Chuy, the man who had become the cartel's chief enforcer. Having operated with a significant degree of autonomy under Ramón, he now moved to consolidate his power, believing his experience and ruthless efficiency made him the natural successor. Arrayed against him was the remaining Arellano Félix family, who were determined to keep the empire within their bloodline. This faction was led by the quiet but formidable Inedina Arellano Félix, the sister who had long operated in the background. With Benjamin captured and Ramón dead, Inedina emerged from the shadows, revealing a steely resolve and a sharp intellect that her brothers had relied upon for years. She was not a frontline enforcer, but a master of logistics, finance, and strategy. Aligning with her were her brothers, Francisco Rafael and Eduardo, though their influence was waning. The power struggle was not a mere corporate takeover. It was a violent and chaotic conflict fought in the streets of Tijuana with the same brutality once reserved for the Sinaloa cartel. Hitmen loyal to Labra and those loyal to the Arellano Félix family turned on each other, leading to a new wave of assassinations and gun battles. Safe houses associated with one faction were raided by the other. The organization, once a model of discipline, if savage efficiency, was fragmenting into warring cliques. This internal chaos provided the perfect opportunity for their external enemies to strike. The Sinaloa Cartel, led by the resilient Chapo Guzmán, saw the disarray as a historic chance to finally seize the prized Tijuana corridor. Guzmán's forces launched a full-scale invasion, intensifying their attacks on the weakened Tijuana Cartel's operations, ambushing their smuggling teams, and aggressively attempting to corrupt or kill their remaining key lieutenants. The body count, already horrifically high, climbed to new peaks as Tijuana became a three-way battlefield between the Sinaloa interlopers, the Labra faction, and the Arellano Félix loyalists. Meanwhile, the law enforcement pressure did not abate, it intensified, exploiting the cartel's vulnerability. With the top leadership gone, mid-level operatives became far more susceptible to offers of deals and protection from the authorities. Informants began to provide crucial intelligence on the whereabouts of the remaining leadership and the cartel's evolving structure. It was in this climate of paranoia and betrayal that the next major blow fell. In 2006, Jesus Labra Avais, the man who had aspired to rule the empire, was captured by the Mexican army in Mexico City. His arrest was a significant victory for the government and a devastating loss for the cartel's operational capabilities, removing its most experienced and brutal field general. His capture also effectively ended the internal civil war, solidifying Enadina's precarious position as the de facto leader of what remained of the Arellano Félix organization. But the victory was Pyrrhic. She was now the queen of a shattered kingdom, presiding over a deeply wounded organization that was bleeding territory, revenue, and personnel. The golden river of cocaine that had once flowed so effortlessly through their hands was now being diverted by their rivals. The Tijuana Cartel was no longer the undisputed, monolithic power it once was. It was a wounded animal, surrounded by predators and hunters, fighting a desperate, rearguard action for its very survival. The era of Enadina Arellano Félix's leadership marked a profound transformation for the cartel, a strategic pivot from brazen, public dominance to a quieter, more resilient form of survival. The queen had taken the throne, but her crown was one of thorns, presiding over an organization that was a shadow of its former self, perpetually on the defensive. Enadina, a trained accountant who always carried herself with an air of dignified reserve, understood that the old ways, the public massacres, the flamboyant displays of wealth and power, the direct confrontations with the state, had led to the downfall of her brothers. Her strategy was one of stealth and consolidation. She orchestrated a deliberate retreat into the shadows, fragmenting the cartel's operations into smaller, more autonomous, and less conspicuous cells. These cells were given specific tasks. One handled transportation, another enforcement, another money laundering, to create a system where if one cell was compromised, it would not lead to the collapse of the entire network. This decentralized model made the organization harder for law enforcement to track and penetrate. Corruption remained the cornerstone of her strategy, but it became more targeted and discreet, focusing on mid-level officials who could provide specific services without drawing the high-level attention that Benjamin's widespread bribery network had. The overt, theatrical violence that Ramón had championed was largely abandoned. Killings still occurred, of course, but they were more surgical, less public, designed to eliminate specific threats rather than to broadcast a message of terror to the entire world. The goal was no longer to rule Tijuana with an iron fist from a throne of skulls, but to operate profitably and sustainably beneath the radar. During this period, the cartel also diversified its revenue streams beyond just cocaine. Methamphetamine production and trafficking became a major focus, as the profit margins were even higher and the supply chain, which could be entirely domestic, was less vulnerable to interdiction than the long route from South America. They also intensified their involvement in kidnapping, extortion, and human trafficking, crimes that directly preyed upon the local population of Tijuana in a way they had previously avoided, signaling a grim new chapter for the city's citizens. While Enadina provided the strategic direction, the day-to-day operations and the dangerous work of enforcement fell increasingly to the next generation. Her son, Luis Fernando S. Sanchez Arellano, known as El Ingeniero, or the engineer, was gradually groomed to take over the operational reins. American, educated, and more of a businessman than a traditional narco, he represented the new face of the cartel, less about personal brutality and more about efficient, corporate-style management of crime. Under this new, low-profile leadership, the Tijuana Cartel managed to stabilize. They lost their absolute monopoly over the plaza, forced to share the lucrative route with the invading Sinaloa Cartel and other smaller groups in an uneasy, constantly shifting truce that was frequently broken by bouts of violence. They were no longer the undisputed brothers of death, but they were far from extinct. They had adapted, evolved, and found a way to persist. This phase demonstrated the Hydra-like nature of such criminal organizations. Chop off the most visible heads, and new, more cautious ones grow in their place. The reign of Enadina and Fernando was a testament to the cartel's enduring corruption and its deep, tangled roots in the local economy and power structure. They proved that the organization was more than just the sum of its founding brothers. It was a criminal ecosystem that could mutate and survive even after its most iconic figures had fallen. The empire had crumbled, but a powerful, dangerous criminal franchise remained, operating in the long shadow cast by the legends of Benjamín and Ramón, a ghost of its former self, but a ghost that was still very much armed, very much profitable, and very much in the game. The relative stability that Enadina and her son Luis Fernando S. Sanchez Arellano had painstakingly built, this new era of quiet, corporate-style criminality, could not last forever under the relentless and patient gaze of international law enforcement. The United States government had not forgotten the Arellano Félix organization. The indictments against its leaders remained active, and the pursuit continued, albeit with a different focus. The strategy evolved from seeking a dramatic, decapitating strike to a methodical, grinding campaign of attrition. American agencies, primarily the DEA and FBI, working in unprecedented cooperation with their Mexican counterparts, employed a multi-pronged approach. They continued to target the cartel's financial infrastructure, using sophisticated tracking methods to follow the complex money laundering networks that stretched from Tijuana into the financial centers of the United States and beyond. Every frozen account, every seized property, and every arrested money launderer was a small cut, slowly bleeding the organization of its lifeblood. Simultaneously, the legal net woven years earlier began to tighten around the remaining members of the old guard. In 2006, Francisco Rafael Arellano Félix El Tigrillo was arrested in Tijuana, while his operational role had diminished. His capture was symbolically significant, another piece of the founding family removed from the board. He was eventually extradited to the United States. Then, in 2008, the last of the original brothers still at large in Mexico, Eduardo Arellano Félix El Doctor, was located. After a dramatic, hours-long shootout with Mexican military forces in Tijuana, where his home was riddled with bullets and grenade shrapnel, he was finally captured, hiding in a secret compartment within a closet. His arrest marked the end of an era. Every one of the Arellano Félix brothers was now either dead or in custody. The focus then shifted squarely onto the new leadership. Inedina and her son Luis Fernando became the top priority targets. The pressure on their operation was immense and unyielding. Key lieutenants were picked off one by one, either arrested or turned into informants. The cartel's operational capacity was severely degraded. Its ability to move large shipments, hampered by constant surveillance and infiltrated communication channels. The final, definitive blow to this chapter of the cartel's history fell on June 23, 2014. Luis Fernando Sanchez Arellano, El Ingeniero, the anointed successor who had tried to modernize and streamline the family business, was arrested by the Mexican military in Tijuana. He was apprehended not in a violent confrontation, but quietly. While playing golf, a stark contrast to the dramatic ends of his uncles, his capture signaled the complete dismantling of the Arellano Félix family's direct, hands-on control over the organization they had founded a quarter-century earlier. With Fernando's arrest, Inedina Arellano Félix, the matriarch, was now the last one standing, the final major figure from the dynasty's zenith still at large. Her legend grew as she continued to evade capture. A ghostly presence believed to be pulling strings from the deepest shadows, but her practical power was vastly diminished. The empire was truly gone, its leadership eradicated, its structure fractured. The Tijuana Cartel, as a unified, family-run entity, had effectively ceased to exist. In its place remained a name, a brand, and a disputed territory, now fought over by the remnants of the old organization. Known as the Cartel Tijuana Nueva Generación and the ever-encroaching Sinaloa Cartel, the fall was now complete. The story that had begun with the ambitious seizure of a plaza in 1989 had concluded 25 years later, with the last of the ruling family in prison or in hiding. The long arm of justice, though slow and imperfect, had finally reached its target, proving that no criminal empire, no matter how powerful, wealthy, or feared, is truly immortal. With the direct lineage of the Arellano Félix dynasty effectively severed, the story of organized crime in Tijuana did not end. It simply entered a new, more fragmented and complex chapter. The powerful vacuum left by their downfall was not filled by a single, dominant entity, but became a bloody, contested arena for a multitude of factions, each vying for a piece of the lucrative prize. The primary contenders were the remnants of the old guard, now operating under the banner of the cartel Tijuana Nueva Generación, or CTNG, and the ever-expanding Sinaloa Cartel, which saw the weakness of its old rival as a golden opportunity for a final conquest. The CTNG was not a unified command under a single leader like the Arellano Félix organization had been. It was a loose coalition of surviving lieutenants, enforcers, and cell leaders from the original cartel who attempted to keep the franchise alive and resist the Sinaloa invasion. However, without the centralized, iron-fisted control of the founding family, the CTNG was plagued by internal rivalries and a lack of coherent strategy, making it a weaker, though still dangerous, opponent. Against them stood the Sinaloa Cartel, now at the peak of its power under the leadership of the recently escaped Joaquin El Chapo Guzmán. The Sinaloa Cartel was a more sophisticated, more globally connected, and more financially robust organization. They waged a relentless campaign to seize the Tijuana Plaza, employing a combination of overwhelming violence and strategic co-option, convincing or forcing many former Arellano Félix operatives to switch their allegiance. The war for Tijuana reignited with a ferocity that mirrored, and in some ways surpassed, the worst days of the 1990s. The city's murder rate soared to unprecedented levels, with decapitated bodies hung from bridges and public shootouts becoming a near daily occurrence. This conflict was further complicated by the emergence of other players, most notably the Jalisco Cartel New Generation, or CJNG, a hyper-violent and ambitious organization that began to challenge both the Sinaloa Cartel and the CTNG for control of various criminal enterprises in the region. The battlefield was no longer a simple duel between two cartels. It was a multi-sided free-for-all, a state of near anarchy, where alliances shifted by the hour and the civilian population was caught in a perpetual crossfire. This fragmentation had a direct and devastating impact on the nature of violence in Tijuana. While the Arellano Félix Brothers had used brutality as a calculated tool for business and intimidation, this new generation of criminals often employed violence more indiscriminately. Extortion, kidnapping, and street-level drug dealing became more rampant, directly affecting the lives of ordinary citizens in a way that the old cartel, in its prime, had often avoided to maintain a semblance of order necessary for its large-scale operations. The narcomensages became more gruesome and public, the tactics more savage. The very fabric of the city was torn asunder by this perpetual state of war. This period starkly illustrated a grim reality of the drug war. The fall of a major cartel does not necessarily bring peace. It often simply decentralizes the violence, creating a more chaotic and unpredictable landscape. The legend of the Arellano Félix Brothers, in a strange and tragic twist, began to be viewed by some with a perverse sense of nostalgia, a remembrance of a time when, as the saying goes, there was only one devil you knew. Their reign was one of terror, but it was a structured terror, a predictable darkness. The chaos that followed their fall was a hydra-headed monster, far more difficult to combat, understand, or contain. The legal reckoning for the Arellano Félix Brothers, long delayed by their power and influence, finally began in earnest within the cold, imposing courtrooms of the United States, marking a stark and definitive conclusion to their decades-long evasion of justice. The American judicial system, which they had so flagrantly challenged with their cross-border hit squads and endless stream of narcotics, became the ultimate arbiter of their fate. The first of the brothers to face judgment in the U.S. was Francisco Rafael Il Tigrillo, extradited in 2008. He was confronted with the mountain of evidence compiled by federal prosecutors over nearly 2 decades. In the face of an incontrovertible case, he chose to plead guilty to racketeering and conspiracy to launder money, admitting his role as a high-level organizer and financial manager for the cartel. In 2012, he was sentenced to a term of imprisonment, a relatively lenient outcome likely influenced by his cooperation with authorities, a final, pragmatic betrayal by one of the founding members in exchange for a reduced sentence. The most significant trial, however, was that of the patriarch, the mastermind himself, Benjamin Arellano Félix, extradited in 2011. His trial in a San Diego federal court was the culmination of one of the most extensive investigations in DEA history. The prosecution presented a sweeping narrative of the cartel's rise and reign, supported by a treasure trove of evidence, seized financial records, intercepted communications, and the damning testimony of former cartel associates who had turned government witnesses. They painted a picture of Benjamin as the cold, calculating CEO of a criminal corporation responsible for importing hundreds of tons of drugs and for orchestrating a campaign of violence that had claimed countless lives. In 2012, facing the certainty of conviction, Benjamin, the once untouchable lord of Tijuana, also entered a guilty plea. His admission of guilt was a moment of profound symbolic power, the final surrender of the architect. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison, a term that, given his age, was effectively a life sentence. The legal proceedings laid bare the sheer scale of the empire he had built and the cold efficiency with which it had operated. Later, in 2018, Eduardo Arellano Félix El Doctor, the last brother to be captured, was also extradited to the United States. He too pleaded guilty to charges of racketeering and money laundering conspiracy, receiving a sentence of 15 years in prison. The outcomes for the brothers were uniforms. Maximum security American prisons, their world shrunk from a transnational empire to a concrete cell. Their power and influence extinguished completely. These court cases served a purpose far beyond simply incarcerating aging kingpins. They were a cathartic and definitive closing of a dark chapter. They provided a formal, legal record of the cartel's atrocities, validating the decades of work by dedicated agents and prosecutors for the victims and for the societies of both Mexico and the United States. It was a form of belated justice, a declaration that no one is above the law, no matter how long it takes for that law to reach them. The brothers, who had lived by the sword and the bribe, ultimately fell by the slow, meticulous, and unyielding process of the very system they had mocked and evaded for so long. Their final legacy was not one of glorious defiance, but of guilty pleas and prison numbers, a humbling end for men who had once commanded armies of gunmen and corrupted entire governments. The courtrooms became the final battlefield, and on this field, they were utterly and completely defeated. The story of the Arellano Félix Brothers is far more than a simple chronicle of crime and punishment. It is a complex and dark tapestry woven with threads that reveal profound truths about power, corruption, and the very nature of the modern drug war. To understand their legacy is to look beyond the bodies and the billions of dollars and to see the indelible marks they left on the institutions, the geography, and the collective psyche of two nations. Their most immediate and devastating legacy was the normalization of extreme, theatrical violence as a tool of criminal enterprise. Before their ascent, Mexican drug trafficking, while brutal, often operated with a certain code, a desire to remain somewhat clandestine. The Arellano Félix Brothers, particularly through Ramon's innovations, weaponized spectacle. They understood that a mutilated body, left in a public square with a threatening message, could paralyze a city with fear more effectively than a dozen silent assassinations. This tactic of narcomensages became a standard operating procedure for every major cartel that followed, escalating the gruesomeness of the violence and dragging the horrors of the drug war directly into the public sphere in a way that was previously unthinkable. Their model of a corporatized, vertically integrated criminal organization with dedicated departments for logistics, finance, enforcement, and corruption became the blueprint for the 21st century cartel. They were pioneers in understanding the border not as a barrier, but as a fluid economic zone to be exploited, perfecting cross-border smuggling techniques, from sophisticated tunnels to corrupted official networks that are still in use today. Their reign also exposed the profound and systemic vulnerability of the Mexican state to corruption. They did not merely bribe a few police officers. They conducted a wholesale takeover of entire government agencies, from local police forces to the federal judiciary and the military. This created a shadow state, a parallel authority where the cartel's law was the ultimate law. The depth of this corruption, which they exploited so masterfully, continues to be a cancer eating away at Mexico's democracy and rule of law, a problem that persists long after their imprisonment. Furthermore, their war with the Sinaloa cartel set a precedent for inter-cartel conflicts that would define the next 2 decades in Mexico. The personal, vengeful nature of their feud, marked by the targeting of family members and the sheer scale of the bloodshed, became a template for the cartel wars that would later engulf other parts of the country, leading to the catastrophic levels of violence seen in the late 2000s and 2010s. On a human level, their story is a tragic saga of how a single family's ambition can unleash a tsunami of suffering that washes over generations. The brothers themselves were transformed from the children of a school teacher into monsters of their own creation, their humanity eroded by absolute power and paranoia. The people of Tijuana paid the highest price, living for years in a state of siege, their city's name becoming internationally synonymous with danger and death, and finally, their eventual downfall, achieved through decades of binational cooperation stands as a testament to the persistence of justice, but also as a grim lesson in its limitations. For while the architects were caught, the system they built, the economic incentives, the social dislocation, the entrenched corruption, proved far more resilient. The Tijuana Cartel's structure may have fractured, but the conditions that allowed it to flourish remain, ensuring that the peace following their fall was not an end to the violence, but merely a change in its management. The Arellano Félix Brothers were not an anomaly. They were a product of a specific time and place, and their legacy is the world they helped create. A world where criminal empires operate as shadow states, where violence is a mass media spectacle, and where the war for the soul of a nation is fought daily on its streets and in its institutions. To truly grasp the monumental scale of the Arellano Félix Brothers' criminal enterprise, one must move beyond the narrative of violence and delve into the cold, staggering numbers that defined their economic empire. A financial juggernaut whose reach corrupted economies and whose profits became a dark engine fueling their war machine. At its zenith, the Tijuana Cartel was not merely a drug trafficking organization. It was one of the most profitable and efficient multinational corporations in the world, albeit one that operated entirely outside the law. U.S. federal prosecutors and intelligence agencies estimate that at the height of their power, in the mid-1990s, the cartel was generating revenues of well over $200 million per week. This astronomical figure was derived from their masterful control of the Tijuana, San Diego corridor, the single most valuable piece of narcotics real estate on the planet. They operated a toll booth-style system, charging a peso or tax on every kilogram of cocaine, marijuana, and later methamphetamine that passed through their territory, in addition to moving their own multi-ton shipments. Annually, this translated to a cash flow of approximately 10 and 12 billion, a sum that rivaled the gross domestic product of small nations and dwarfed the annual budgets of the very law enforcement agencies tasked with stopping them. The logistical challenge was not just moving drugs, but moving this unimaginable volume of physical cash, hundreds of millions of dollars in small, used bills, back across the border into Mexico. This was achieved through an equally sophisticated and brazen money laundering apparatus. Armored vehicles, disguised as legitimate cash, transport services carried billions of dollars from distribution hubs in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Atlanta directly to the border. Corrupted customs officials on both sides ensured these shipments passed without inspection. Once in Mexico, the money was integrated into the financial system through a web of shell companies, currency exchange houses, front businesses, and investments in real estate, construction, tourism, and agriculture. They bought hotels, restaurants, nightclubs, and vast tracts of land, creating a veneer of legitimate wealth while simultaneously cleaning their profits. The cartel's operational expenses were equally colossal. A significant portion of their revenue, estimated to be in the tens of millions of dollars each month, was dedicated solely to corruption, the mordida, or bite, that greased the wheels of their entire operation. This payroll included thousands of individuals, from the local Tijuana police officer paid a few $100s to look the other way, to state and federal police commanders receiving tens of thousands monthly, all the way up to multi-million-dollar bribes to high-ranking politicians, army generals, and officials in the Mexican Attorney General's office. Another massive expense was their armed wing. The salaries, weapons, vehicles, and safe houses for Ramon's army of Narco. Juniors and other enforcers represented a multi-million-dollar monthly investment. They purchased state-of-the-art weaponry, often from the United States, including assault rifles, grenade launchers, 50 caliber sniper rifles, and even attempted to acquire surface-to-air missiles. The brothers' personal lifestyles, while a minuscule fraction of their overall wealth, were legendary for their opulence. They owned fleets of armored luxury cars, fleets of yachts, and collections of multi-million-dollar homes and ranches, all fortified with sophisticated security systems and guarded by platoons of gunmen. This financial ecosystem was a self-perpetuating cycle. Drugs moved north generated cash, which was used to pay for corruption and violence, which in turn protected and expanded the drug routes, generating more cash. The sheer economic power they wielded gave them a form of sovereignty, allowing them to operate a shadow state that competed with and often overpowered the legitimate government. When the U.S. and Mexican governments finally began to seriously target this financial infrastructure in the early 2000s, seizing hundreds of properties and freezing bank accounts, it was a critical strategic blow. It demonstrated that while the brothers could withstand arrests and gunfights, they could not long survive the systematic destruction of the economic foundation upon which their entire empire and its vast network of complicity was built. The money was the real source of their power, and without it, their kingdom of fear was destined to crumble. Beyond the towering figures of Benjamín and Ramón, the sustained power of the Arellano Félix organization was built upon a deep bench of loyalists, specialists, and enforcers, a network of key lieutenants whose skills and ruthlessness allowed the empire to function with terrifying efficiency for so long. Understanding these individuals is crucial to understanding how the cartel operated as a criminal corporation. One of the most pivotal and feared figures was Ismael, El Mayo, Higuera Guerrero. He was not just a hired gun. He was a trusted confidant of Ramón and one of the cartel's primary operational chiefs, directly overseeing the logistics of moving multi-ton shipments of cocaine from Colombia through Mexico and across the border. His knowledge of the routes, the trafficking methods, and the corrupt officials involved was encyclopedic, making him one of the most valuable and protected assets within the organization. His capture by Mexican authorities in 2000 was a severe blow to the cartel's core smuggling operations, disrupting a key part of their supply chain and providing investigators with a treasure trove of intelligence. Another central figure was Arturo El Kitty Piaz, a close associate of the brothers who managed a significant portion of their money laundering empire. He was the architect behind many of the front companies and financial schemes that cleaned hundreds of millions of dollars, integrating the illicit profits into the legitimate economies of both Mexico and the United States. His operations were so extensive that when he was eventually indicted in the U.S., the list of seized assets read like a portfolio of a major conglomerate. Then there was the infamous hitman, David D. Baron Corona, the commander of the Cross Border Assassination Squad, whose activities in San Diego brought the cartel's war to American soil. His conviction and life sentence were a direct result of the Blancornelis case, removing a highly capable and dangerously ambitious operator from the field. The organization also relied on a cadre of corrupt officials who were so integral they functioned as de facto lieutenants. A prime example was Jesus Abraham Rubio, a former commander in the Mexican Federal Judicial Police in Tijuana. For years, he was not merely on the cartel's payroll, he was an active participant, using his authority to provide them with sensitive law enforcement intelligence, derail investigations, and even directly participating in the planning of criminal operations. His betrayal from within the ranks of the state was a testament to the depth of the cartel's penetration. The arrest and conviction of these key lieutenants, which occurred with increasing frequency in the early 2000s, was a critical component of the strategy to dismantle the cartel. The U.S. and Mexican governments employed a kingpin strategy, aiming not only for the heads of the organization, but also for the vital organs, the logistical brains, the financial managers, and the most effective enforcers. Each lieutenant captured represented a node in the network that was permanently severed. They provided investigators with a deeper understanding of the cartel's structure, leading to further arrests and seizures. The downfall of these men followed a familiar pattern. Some, like Baron, were tried and imprisoned for life in the United States. Others, like Higura Guerrero, faced justice in Mexico, often receiving lengthy sentences, and many others met a more brutal end, killed in the internal purges or in the endless war with the Sinaloa cartel. The systematic removal of this supporting cast of characters was like disassembling a complex machine. Even with Benjamín, the chief engineer, still giving orders from hiding, the machine began to break down without its essential components. The loss of a logistical mastermind like Higura Guerrero could cause months of disruption and financial loss. The capture of a financial wizard like Pava forced the cartel to rebuild its money, laundering apparatus from scratch, a vulnerable and risky process. The network of trust and proven competence that had taken years to build was being systematically eradicated, leaving the organization increasingly reliant on less experienced, less trustworthy, and more desperate individuals. This attrition at the lieutenant level was a death by 1,000 cuts, a slow but inexorable bleeding that weakened the beast until it was finally weak enough for the final, decisive blows against its leadership to land with full, crushing force. The war waged by the Arellano Félix Brothers was not confined to the physical battlegrounds of city streets and desert smuggling routes. It was also a war for the soul of Tijuana, a relentless assault on its social fabric, its culture, and the very psyche of its citizens, the long-term consequences of which would linger for generations, long after the brothers themselves were gone. The constant, pervasive violence instilled a deep-seated culture of fear that became the new normal for the city's inhabitants. Ordinary daily activities, going out for dinner, letting children play outside, commuting to work, were shadowed by the unspoken but ever-present risk of being caught in a shootout or a grenade attack. The sound of sirens, which once signaled help, now often heralded another act of carnage. This environment bred a collective trauma, a condition of hyper-vigilance and anxiety that affected the mental health of the entire community. The social contract, the basic trust between citizens and the state, was utterly shattered when the police, the judiciary, and even the military are known to be on the payroll of the cartel. Who does a person turn to for protection? This profound disillusionment and cynicism led to a devastating erosion of civic engagement and a normalization of lawlessness that extended beyond the cartels themselves. Furthermore, the cartel's economic influence created a distorted local economy. While their vast investments in real estate and construction created some legitimate jobs, this was a poisoned prosperity. It inflated prices, making it harder for honest citizens to afford housing, and it created an economy dependent on illicit cash flows. For many young people in Tijuana, the cartel presented a seductive, if deadly, alternative to a life of limited opportunity. The Narco Juniors were the most prominent example, but the cartel's need for drivers, lookouts, money couriers, and enforcers offered quick money and a sense of power that the formal economy could not match. This warped the aspirations of a generation, glamorizing a path that almost inevitably led to an early death or imprisonment. The city's international reputation was also catastrophically damaged. Tijuana, a city with a rich culture and a vibrant cross-border identity, became globally synonymous with danger, murder, and chaos. This perception devastated its vital tourism industry. American visitors, once the lifeblood of the city's restaurants, bars, and shops, largely stayed away, dealing a crippling blow to legitimate small businesses and further impoverishing the city. The very identity of Tijuana was rewritten not by its artists, its entrepreneurs, or its citizens, but by the violent narrative of the Arellano Félix Brothers. Journalists who attempted to report on the truth faced an impossible choice: self-censorship or death. Many reporters were threatened, kidnapped, or murdered, creating an information blackout that allowed the cartel to operate with even greater impunity and further isolated the citizens in their fear. The public spaces of the city, its plazas and streets, were transformed from places of community and commerce into potential killing fields, changing how people interacted with their own urban environment. Families who could afford to leave did so, creating a brain drain and a loss of social capital. For those who remained, a grim resignation set in, a survival mechanism that involved seeing without seeing, hearing without hearing, and knowing without speaking. The legacy of this social and psychological devastation is perhaps the most enduring and difficult to repair. You can rebuild a building shattered by a grenade, but how do you rebuild trust? How do you restore a sense of safety and community that has been systematically terrorized for over a decade? The reign of the Arellano Félix Brothers did not just end with their arrests. It left behind a wounded city, a society grappling with a deep and complex trauma, a generation scarred by violence, and a painful lesson in the catastrophic human cost that lies behind the headlines of drug seizures and kingpin captures. The true price of their empire was paid not in dollars, but in the shattered lives and stolen peace of an entire metropolis. The hunt for the Arellano Félix Brothers and the subsequent war to dismantle their empire necessitated an unprecedented level of cooperation between the United States and Mexico, a complex and often fraught partnership that would redefine cross-border law enforcement for the 21st century. This collaboration was born out of sheer necessity. The cartel's operations were intrinsically binational, and no single agency or country could hope to combat them alone. On the American side, the lead was taken by the Drug Enforcement Administration, which established a dedicated task force focused solely on the Tijuana Cartel. They were supported by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, particularly after the violence spilled into California. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, which tracked the cartel's massive weapons acquisitions, and Customs and Border Protection, which worked to harden the very border the cartel exploited. On the Mexican side, the effort involved a rotating cast of agencies, including the Mexican Federal Judicial Police, the Office of the Attorney General, and crucially, the Mexican military, which was increasingly deployed to perform law enforcement functions in cartel hotspots. The cornerstone of this cooperation was intelligence sharing. The DEA, with its global network of informants and sophisticated electronic surveillance capabilities, would gather information on drug shipments, money laundering routes, and the movements of key cartel members. This intelligence was then passed, often through liaison officers stationed in Mexico City, to their Mexican counterparts, who would use it to conduct raids and arrests. The flow of information was not a one-way street. Mexican authorities provided critical insights into the local power structures and corruption networks that their American partners could never fully grasp from the outside. This partnership, however, was perpetually walking a tightrope over a chasm of mutual distrust and sovereignty concerns. American agents often complained of the deep-seated corruption within Mexican agencies, fearing that sensitive intelligence would be leaked directly back to the cartel, jeopardizing operations and endangering lives. The Mexican government, in turn, was highly sensitive to any perception of American infringement on its national sovereignty, and was often reluctant to grant U.S. agents any operational authority on its soil. The extradition process became a critical and often politically charged tool. The United States aggressively sought the extradition of the Arellano Félix Brothers and their lieutenants, where they faced longer sentences and more secure prisons. Successive Mexican presidents, under immense pressure from Washington, gradually expanded the scope for extraditions, but it remained a slow and contentious process, with Mexican courts often requiring that the death penalty be taken off the table, a condition U.S. prosecutors had to accept. The collaboration also extended to financial investigations. The U.S. Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network worked with Mexican banking regulators to trace and seize cartel assets, though this was a constant game of cat and mouse against the cartel's sophisticated money launderers. Joint investigations, like the one that followed the cross-border hit squad, became models for this new era of cooperation, proving that despite the immense challenges, it was possible to achieve significant victories. The pressure exerted by this binational effort was relentless and multi-faceted. It was not a single battle, but a protracted siege involving thousands of agents, analysts, and prosecutors on both sides of the border. They attacked the cartel from every conceivable angle, arresting its leaders, seizing its drugs, freezing its assets, and prosecuting its enforcers. This sustained, coordinated pressure created an environment in which the cartel could no longer operate with impunity. Every shipment was at risk, every financial transaction was suspect, and every trusted lieutenant was a potential informant. The fall of the Arellano Félix Brothers, therefore, stands as one of the first major success stories of this modern, integrated approach to combating transnational organized crime. It proved that such criminal empires could be brought down, but it also highlighted the extraordinary investment of time, resources, and diplomatic capital required. The framework of cooperation, with all its flaws and tensions, that was forged in the fire of the Tijuana Cartel War, would become the essential blueprint for all subsequent efforts to combat the even more powerful cartels that would rise in its wake. As the dust settled on the shattered remnants of the Arellano Félix Brothers were led away in handcuffs to their lives and the laos of the war. A profound and unsettling question emerged from the rubble. Was it all worth it? The cost of this decades-long war, both in human life and national treasure, was so astronomically high that it demands a sober and critical reflection on its outcomes and the enduring nature of the conflict itself. On one hand, the dismantling of the Tijuana Cartel was an undeniable and hard-won victory for justice. It demonstrated that even the most powerful and feared criminal organizations are not invincible. The perseverance of dedicated law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and intelligence analysts on both sides of the border had ultimately prevailed. It delivered a form of closure to the families of the countless victims, from the murdered cardinal and the DEA agents to the thousands of anonymous citizens of Tijuana, whose lives were cut short or irrevocably scarred by the violence. The successful prosecutions in U.S. courts affirmed the principle of accountability, proving that the long arm of the law could, eventually, reach into the highest echelons of criminal power. The removal of the Arellano Félix Brothers from the board did bring a measure of stability to Tijuana, as the chaotic, multi-sided war of the early 2000s eventually settled into a more predictable, though still violent, criminal landscape. However, this victory was profoundly Pyrrhic. the fundamental conditions that gave rise to the cartel. The immense demand for illicit drugs in the United States, the economic disparities that make trafficking an attractive option for so many, and the systemic corruption within Mexican institutions remained entirely unchanged. The war did not end the drug trade, it merely reshuffled the players. The vacuum of power left by the Tijuana Cartel was not filled by peace and legality, but by the Sinaloa Cartel and later the Jalisco Cartel New Generation. Organizations that were in many ways more powerful, more globalized, and in the case of the CJNG, even more brutally violent than their predecessors. The violence, instead of disappearing, metastasized, spreading to other parts of Mexico with even greater ferocity, leading to the catastrophic death tolls that characterized the country in the 2010s. The kingpin strategy itself, while successful in this specific case, revealed a critical flaw. Decapitating an organization often leads not to its dissolution, but to its fragmentation, creating smaller, more unpredictable, and more volatile criminal cells that often resort to more predatory crimes like extortion and kidnapping to survive. Furthermore, the massive investment in militarized enforcement on both sides of the border did little to reduce the availability of drugs on American streets or the power of the cartels in Mexico. It was a costly stalemate, a multi-billion-dollar effort that managed the problem rather than solving it. The social and psychological scars on Tijuana, the erosion of trust in government, and the normalization of violence are legacies that will take generations to heal, if they ever fully can. The story of the Arellano Félix Brothers, therefore, serves as a grim and cautionary tale about the limits of a purely enforcement-driven approach to the drug war. It is a story of a battle won, but a war that continues to rage with no end in sight. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth that as long as the root causes, the prohibitive policies, the economic desperation, and the institutional rot remain unaddressed, there will always be new Benjamins, new Ramons, new Enadinas waiting in the wings, ready to seize the next opportunity, to build the next empire on a foundation of blood and money, learning from the mistakes of their predecessors and ensuring that the cycle of violence continues, perhaps in a new form, but with the same devastating consequences for the innocent people caught in the middle. And so, the epic saga of the Arellano Félix Brothers, the once untouchable lords of Tijuana, the self-styled Brothers of Death, reaches its final, quiet conclusion not in a blaze of gunfire, but in the hushed, sterile environments of maximum security prisons, a stark and humbling end for men who had commanded empires. Benjamín, the master strategist, the corporate CEO of crime, now resides as inmate number 89768-108 in a federal penitentiary. His world reduced to a cell, his vast network of power and influence severed, his legacy a case study in the annals of the DEA. Ron, the volatile and feared enforcer, the man who personified the cartel's savage soul, lies in a grave, his life and his legend extinguished on a sin-alone street, a violent end for a man who lived by violence. Francisco, Rafael, and Eduardo, the supporting pillars of the financial and logistical apparatus, likewise serve their long sentences in American prisons, their once sharp minds now occupied with the monotonous passage of time behind bars. And Adina, the matriarch, the last one standing from the dynasty's inner circle, remains a fugitive, a ghost from a bygone era. Her current influence a subject of speculation, but her power a mere echo of what the family once wielded. The story that began with ambition and audacity in the wake of their uncle's empire has now come full circle, ending in incarceration, death, and irrelevance. The Tijuana Cartel, as a unified family-run entity, is a relic of history, its name now used by a fractured remnant or adopted as a brand by lesser criminals, a faded flag over a conquered kingdom. The shimmering, neon-lit bridge of Tijuana still stands. The river of illicit commerce still flows, but the toll booth masters are different. The war for the plaza continues, a perpetual struggle between new cartels, a testament to the unyielding economics of supply and demand that no amount of enforcement has been able to quell. The story of the Arellano Félix Brothers is now complete, a dark and bloody chapter in the history of the Americas, a cautionary tale of the corrupting nature of absolute power and the devastating human cost of the drug war. It is a story of a family that reached for the sun and seized it, only to be consumed by the very fire that gave them light. They built a kingdom of cocaine and corpses, a monument to their own ambition, and in the end, that monument became their tomb. They sought immortality through power and fear, but they achieved only notoriety. Their names forever etched not on a hall of fame, but on a wall of infamy, a permanent reminder of a time when a single family held a city, a nation, and an international border in the grip of terror. Their rise was meteoric, their reign was brutal, and their fall was inevitable. The echoes of their empire have faded, but the lessons remain, waiting for a world willing to learn them. And with that, the final page turns on the story of the Arellano Félix Brothers.